So good evening, everybody, or good morning, Dr. Luke. My name is Kristen, and on behalf of the Multiolelo team, I'd like to welcome you to our fourth and last webinar series presentation on language research communication. Multiolelo, or ML for short, is a student-led initiative aiming to make language research findings more accessible and engaging in multiple languages through various ways of communication. Before we begin, the Multiolelo team would like to thank the Department of Second Language Studies here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa for their continuous support for the Multiolelo initiative since it was established in 2018. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for today's webinar session, Dr. Friederike Lüpke. I hope I said that correctly, sorry. Dr. Lüpke is a professor of African Studies at the University of Helsinki and a professional research associate at SOAS at the University of London. She is chair of AfriStudy, the African Research Forum in Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Helsinki. Her research is on rural multilingualism in Senegal, has been central for the emerging inter and multidisciplinary field of small-scale multilingualism studies. Multilingualism is not only a focal area of her research, what makes sustainable multilingual ecologies and how they can be nurtured in families, small-scale settings, and international higher education environments is a question that underpins her teaching, language learning currently of Finnish, and interaction at the university and beyond. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Lüpke.
Thank you very much for this invitation. And also, I think the initiative that you have built is really fantastic. So congratulations on doing that in such a distributed form as well. So the topic of my presentation is squaring the language-ing circle. And I hope it will become clear through the presentation what I mean by that. Let's start by laying down some foundations. So the general background when we talk about literacy, education, and multilingualism in education, the baseline is actually a very negative one. Around 80% of Africans are educated in languages they don't speak in their daily lives, because these are colonially inherited official languages which are not really used in daily life, are not part of people's repertoires, and they're also not taught as subjects in education. They are treated as if they were languages already spoken by people, although they are not. So basic education takes place in these languages that pupils have never been exposed to before starting school. There have been attempts at introducing local languages of African origin in education, but this has not been very successful. And one of the reasons is the highly dynamic multilingual picture that we find throughout the continent. And so a selection of languages based on language areas has actually increased exclusion rather than repairing it. So it's been quite counterproductive. So the question then is, how can we break with colonial ideas of language and make education inclusive and multilingual? And my point of view is that we need inclusive and flexible multilingual models that are also adaptable, because multilingual repertoires are not static, they're fluid and dynamic, and we need new visions of literacy and education that are able to adapt to this fluidity. And I hope to convince you that LILIEMA, the program that I'm going to talk about today, is one possibility for such a model. But first, in the title, I alluded to this dichotomy between language and languaging, and two different views of what language is and what it does. and also to ideas that are associated with different contexts or social linguistic spaces. So language normally is seen as this fixed system that can be associated with a particular geographic area, and also with speakers, and that has strict boundaries. We can put it in a book, a grammar, a dictionary. We further solidify this language through language-based writing, where we make sure through script and orthographic choices that potentially polyvalent forms can be unambiguously identified with one language. And on the other hand, this is never, of course, we know that there is no unmixed language, so this system always leaks and multilingualism comes in. But there is another context and another vision of language, that of languaging, that is really based on something completely different and looks not at what people do with one language. It doesn't see them as monolingual, but looks at the flexible and adaptive use of linguistic resources, and acknowledges also that speech is always heteroglossic and internally heterogeneous and mixed, because even if speakers try to stay within the confines of a named language, we know that there are register and style differences that can be named. So multilingualism is a matter of degree, and we don't have any pure monolingual homogeneous language-based speech or language use at all. But it's crucial to take with you for the remainder of this presentation that this dichotomy does not only capture different ideas of language, but, as I will argue, also these visions are associated with different contexts of language use or social linguistic spaces. And another thing I would like us to pay attention to from the outset is this. We cannot, okay, taking one step back, all of you, I'm sure, are aware of the fact that currently languaging approaches, so approaches that look at how multilingual speakers can use their linguistic resources freely and creatively without being reined in by prescriptive monolingual ideas and without being sanctioned, are en vogue, especially in language learning and in applied linguistics. And so very often, if they are seen, these practices are seen to transcend named languages, they are labeled translanguaging. And these approaches are seen as really liberating and doing away with linguistic discrimination and oppression. But my colleague Harshana Rambukwala reminds us that actually it is not simply possible to insert new, more equal language practices into contexts that are shaped by inequality and by societies in which language hierarchies are really important in order to signal, economic and political status. And so he warns us to say that a naive focus on translanguaging only actually risks to increase discrimination of people who are already discriminated against. And if we invest only in translanguaging for contexts that are already marginalized, while the standard language cultures that exist for the languages that hold global currency, so colonial languages in the majority, where these contexts remain prescriptive, then we just increase exclusion. And so this is the backdrop, I think, against which all of us who work in and with the Global South are doing our research and activism. Now let's move to Casamance and I'll tell you a little bit about the context and also about the LILIEMA association. So it's the area, as many areas actually throughout Africa can be characterized as one where we have multilingual people, but monolingual places. So here, brief sketch of multilingual people living together, but very often the places they inhabit are seen as associated with only one language. And this is despite the fact that the people themselves are heterogeneous and that they also move around. There's a lot of migration, exchange within these communities, but also beyond. So the mobility is omnipresent and means that the composition, the inhabitants are constantly being remixed. So you cannot actually say how many languages are spoken anywhere at any given point, because the minute you have enumerated, the languages, the repertoires, which are also very difficult to capture because they're also dynamic, that things have changed. The season has changed. Children have been brought in. Other children have been sent away to relatives to go to school. Women have been married out, have come into the community, etc. So we have a cohabitation of many different people in heterogeneous settlements. And this is compounded by long-established practices of systematically hosting strangers or people, members of professional groups, which are associated with other languages, and also with marriage relationships. But the language that is associated with an area is very often the language of the founders of the place. So it is not meant to exclusively represent the entire complexity of the space. And this means that we cannot simply equate the language community, so speakers who identify with one language, with the speech community. Speech community being people who live together and who share language practices in their daily life. And this is something, these two concepts are very often conflated, but Silverstein here reminds us forcefully that we cannot always think that the language community is also a speech community. And early definitions of the speech community, for instance, this one by Gumpertz, they are not accidental because Gumpertz actually worked in thickly multilingual Indian contexts, already draw attention to the difference between being a speech community and sharing one language. For him, a speech community is a community that shares conventions for the use of verbal signs, regardless of the linguistic differences among these verbal signs. So the speech community can be very multilingual. But because of the dominance of European perspectives and this romantic language nationalism that was en vogue, culminated in the 19th century, Europeans and generally Western observers and linguists normally tend to equate the language community and the speech community and expect somehow to find a monolingual speech community. And this has then repercussions, for instance, on how multilingual education is imagined. So there's always this imagination that it is possible to select a language that can be the mother tongue used in mother tongue-based bilingual education in a given area, for instance. But if we now look at a village, this is Agnac-Grand, it's a tiny village, less than 100 inhabitants, and we look at the households there, I can show you how the speech communities look like and what the different communities of practice are and how they align with languages. So here you see the languages is a high number of languages and it's not exhaustive. And in red, you have some contexts where the nominal language of the place, Baino Kujaha, is spoken. And then you see there are other contexts like the church, the shop, the mosque. They are a little bit away in a different part of the village where this language is not spoken at all. And this is due to the fact that Arabic is the language of the mosque, and the other language associated with Islam is Mandinka. The shopkeeper speaks Wolof and Pular, so nobody could speak Banu Gujaha to him. And the church is dominated by the languages in which the Bible was translated. So this idea that there is one language, Banu Gujaha, that we could associate with this place and could use in education quickly falls away when we look at the context where it's not used. So first, these contexts go away. Then the next places that go away are those of the settled strangers in this community who identify with the nominal languages of their places of origin. And they may speak Gujaha, but since they don't own this language, they will not often claim it when asked about their repertoires. And it doesn't play a focal role in their repertoires. So for instance, if we were to invest in mother tongue-based education, they would not be interested in education in Banu Gujaha. They would be interested perhaps in education in Diola Susana, their identity language. So these contexts go away. So then let's look at what happens in the founder's household. So these are people who identify as Banu Gujaha. But you see already that many languages are used in these households. This is because this language ideology is based on male identity, and people are patrilineal and very local. So the men stay put, they identify with the founders, but the women are married in, very often don't speak Gujaha when they come in. Children are fostered in without speaking this language. So here are also some founders' descendants who identify more as Creoles. So they also identify as Gujaha, but they don't really have it in their active repertoire. So again, these go away. So we have two households which identify as Gujaha, and where Gujaha also plays an important role in their communicative practices, but in a multilingual context where they use many other languages at the same time. So these go away. So then the only really monolingual context in which Banu Gujaha is used almost exclusively, and the only language context where people have the pragmatic intention to only use Banu Gujaha are linguistic elicitations with a linguist who wants to describe Banu Gujaha, so me, and some ancestral shrines where people talk to the ancestors, which are seen as the founders who would have spoken Banu Gujaha. So against this backdrop, as an outcome of a linguistic research project, a collaborative project with great community collaboration and involvement, we decided to invest in a literacy experiment that is adapted and conceived to cater for these multilingual contexts that have a lot of languaging contexts. And the result was LILIEMA, language independent education for multilingual areas, language independent literacy, sorry. So this is the team. This is our president who sadly passed away last year. We haven't replaced him yet, but we have ideas. This is the core team, and you see we have both Senegalese members and Western linguists. And these are our current teachers and 2 trainees as well. And if you are interested in finding out more, you can have a look at our website where you can find details on the courses, the workshops, the teaching philosophy and method. And here you can already see some images of our teaching. So it takes place both in schools and outside. And actually, it's been much more successful outside because people have made so many traumatic experiences in the formal school classroom because of this linguistic exclusion that they experience there on a daily basis as children. Now, first, the alphabet. And that already shows you how we try to square the languaging circle. We did not select the alphabet ourselves, but we used the alphabet that has been developed for Senegal's largest language, Wolof, by Senegalese linguist Aram Fall. And we incorporate additional graphemes, if so desired, by our learners and teachers. And this alphabet has served as the basis for most codified alphabets for those national languages of Senegal that have obtained symbolic recognition as national languages. But, and this is crucial, we do not stick to this alphabet only, but we also allow spelling variations to introduce, to facilitate digital writing, and also to acknowledge people's knowledge and experience of the trans-orthographing linguistic landscapes they see, and you'll get some illustrations a bit later. But here, for instance, you see the velar nasal, for instance, is written with the phonetic character, which is very difficult to type on a keyboard. So we actually suggest alternatives, as we do for other phonetic symbols here and here. And also for other symbols, people have many different experiences in sound-grapheme associations. And we always discuss them and we tolerate them. So for us, it's important that people understand what they do, but we do not want to introduce a prescriptive method. Here is an example of worksheets from the beginners level class. So you see a lot of focus on reading and grapheme recognition, guided writing, but then also some tasks that are inherently as mono or multilingual as the participants desire, because here they are asked to name these vegetables, and we give examples here in 4 different forms that can be associated with several languages. And so people can actually here use their entire repertoire in naming these vegetables. And teachers have a manual that explains the exercise types and also the pedagogical approach. So through this model, LILIEMA can be as mono or multilingual as the teaching situation requires it. So here you see a screenshot from a whiteboard that shows you a writer who wanted to stay within the confines of a named language, in this case, Diola Kudirerai, by drawing these 2 objects and naming them. But at the same time, in any classroom, there will be other speakers of other Diola languages. Diola is a kind of continuum of lects spoken in the entire Casamance, and many forms are shared among all these languages. So any other classroom participant would also recognize these words as shared and be able to say, oh, this is also Diola Foni. Oh, this is also Diola Casa. This showing actually how, language borders are really fictional to a large extent, because what is really different for named languages is only the diverging features. And of course, we know that there's a huge pool of linguistic features that is going to be shared, especially for closely related languages, but also for less closely related languages because of contact. Here you see a gap text with words that I created the gap text exercise, and I had the idea that this would be 3 different languages: Wolof, Creole, Portuguese-based Creole, and Diola. And here it's only Diola because this word again, Busana, is shared, I think, by all Diola languages. It doesn't belong to one specific Diola language only. And you can also see, so here you have kind of under differentiation, and here you see that we immediately also suggest spelling variations when we know that the official alphabet may cause problems. So one other trait of LILIEMA that we consider very important is that it really activates and validates local and regional knowledge, not only linguistic knowledge, but also cultural knowledge. So here you see a photo from women at a soap making workshop. And this workshop is animated by one woman who's very experienced and knows all the recipes. And women come in from all the households. And because the women always marry in to villages in this area of Casamos, the women are really diverse and speak about 10 different languages between them. And the recipes are passed down orally, so the women all rely on the expertise of one woman who is also in high demand, so she's always very busy. And so I was actually invited to come and document this so that the recipes could be written down and shared. And there is no place for sharing or documenting or even appreciating this type of knowledge in the formal school curriculum. And until LILIEMA arrived, people would rely on external people like me to document this knowledge. But now anybody who has attended LILIEMA classes can actually be autonomous and jot down these recipes themselves and share them. So we hope that this valorizes local and regional knowledge. LILIEMA is also really important because the area is a conflict area or post-conflict area. There has been the Guinea-Bissau civil independence war. There has been a secessionist civil war where the south of Senegal wanted to split from the north because the political dominance of the north was perceived as culturally and linguistically alienating. And so there are many NGOs, for instance, who lobby for overcoming what they see as ethnic conflicts. And they use Diola because they have no idea actually of the actual makeup of the population of Anyak. People are so multilingual that they can also be categorized as Diola. But ironically, by choosing one language to do their political work, the NGO actually exacerbates the conflicts that it wants to overcome. So we think that only a truly multilingual education program and only, for instance, multilingual information on important issues can overcome these conflicts. And this is also important because UNESCO, for instance, has decided that it would be best for the whole of Senegal to introduce Wolof in the mother tongue-based multilingual education at primary schools. But Wolof is also a colonial language because it was the language of Senegal that was spoken in the areas where the French first settled down. And so it spread through local intermediaries of French colonial activities. And it's now the language of the North that is the de facto national language. And all other languages have become minoritized in the shade of Wolof, although Wolof has no official status. And so investing in Wolof would really be politically very explosive, or selecting any language for that matter. So inclusive multilingualism is the only answer. And here, another point is that only through using LILIEMA, we can actually create basic literacy in languages the learners know. You have seen the repertoires and linguistic practices are very different and individual. And here, for instance, you have a little girl who came to the village as a foster child. And she spoke a language that is not at all spoken in the village apart from her stepmother. And so she has to learn all the local languages. And then she goes to school and receives her basic education in French. Well, guess how well she's doing? Well, she's not doing well at all because this is a complete cognitive overload for her. And children, teachers are aware of the cognitive difficulties faced by children, but they have no tools and they have no method that would actually enable them to activate the repertoires to help children learn. So they all welcome LILIEMA and actually would like to be able to teach our method in the classroom. So One other aspect of LILIEMA that we hope is very positive is that it is truly inclusive. So it creates spaces for small languages that normally don't have space in writing, especially for language-based writing, because the resources are not available. And also these languages are not very often used in language-based writing, which always aims at larger scale context. So if people, for instance, write on social media, on Facebook, they communicate over wide distances, so they will not use a local language that has only a couple of hundred speakers. Or if they take part in a national discussion forum, they will also not use these languages, or only with some words to index identities. But here in LILIEMA, both the big languages, here you have, for instance, Wolof, and the very small languages that are only spoken in one village can exist side by side. And now, because I think Anna asked me when we were discussing this presentation, she asked me explicitly how we actually show learners how translanguaging works and how we break with this language-based idea of language. And this is actually quite easy. I think it's more difficult for linguists to break with their language ideas than for speakers, because they experience this every day in their life. And here is the first example, then we'll have some other examples. So here are two billboards, advertisements. Here for crisps and here for mineral water. Oops, sorry. And they're both in Wolof and French, to the extent that you can name the languages. And so on the left-hand side, we see the official orthography of Wolof is used for Wolof, and the official orthography of French is used for French. Here you see, so samadom, fromage. And then on the right-hand side, you see that everything in writing looks as if it was French, because the sound-grapheme association conventions of French are used for writing Wolof. So Wolof is written with French. I've called this lead language writing in my writings. And here's an illustration based on one character. So here on the left-hand side, you see nach na gune. Nach is written in the conventions for Wolof in the official alphabet. And the same phone is written following French sound-grapheme association conventions as KH, yielding the same pronunciation. And this is something that people are exposed to. So nobody learns, because local languages are not taught at school, apart from a limited number of experimental schools. People don't learn to write this formally. They don't learn to write this formally, but they all learn how to read and write French. So they need to make sense of this themselves, and they're aware of these multiple possibilities. And they're also aware of the fact that they are ambivalent signs. For instance, here in the product name, which can be read either as Wolof, then it would be krach, chips, or as French. And then X, the grapheme X in French has the pronunciation X. Okay. Both are sound symbolic, so I don't know which one is the preferred one, but people are aware of these multiple possibilities and of this kind of trans-languaging and trans-orthographing landscape. And this is, of course, also present in the teaching context. And here I will show you a video that was taken by Mia Weidel, who cannot be with us today because she's on maternity leave. So have a look at how this multilingual learning takes place in practice. And you will see the languages identified by Mia popping up on your video screen.
Mamba jatombe si pular bengwa.
Dokulo ndo ndok uya sekete ndoko ndok uya udek uya ndo udek uya ndoko nga après nga ci dek uya adik na kasa voilà udek uya udek uya
On. Okay, so here you see it on the blackboard, and you see the categorization. So this was the pragmatic intention of the writers to use these languages, but of course, different categorizations are possible for some forms that are shared beyond the boundaries of named languages. This is not the case in this case for Wolof. Wolof is the most remotely related one, but of course there are some Wanderworte, some words that are widely shared also between Wolof and the other ones. But here the languages that have been identified as Diola, for instance, so different Diola, people with different Diola languages and also linguistic experiences of Diola in their repertoire will identify them, categorize them differently. And the same holds for the two different Bainuk languages that have some really significant emblematic divergences, but also a great degree of overlap. And this I can illustrate briefly here. So here you see the outcome of a writing exercise. Learners were asked to write a shopping list. And this woman, whose shopping list you see here, decided to actually write a multilingual shopping list where she gives the same objects, same items in several languages. But it's interesting that she also then in the discussion in the classroom categorizes these items, and then there are some different perspectives that emerge. So for instance, here the word baguette. So for this woman, who is not an active speaker of any Bainuk language, so for her, this is a Bayot word. It's the word for Guinea sorrel. So Guinea sorrel is really widely used in cooking. So for her, it's a Bayot word. But several participants and teachers speak one or several Bainuk languages where this word also exists and say, no, this is actually Gubaha. Then I come and say, no, because I work on Gujaha, this is Gujaha also. So these are polyvalent words that are, of course, interpreted based on the perspectives and repertoires of these multilingual writers. And the exercise and the classroom discussions then brings out this categorical multivalency. And then what is also interesting is that here she has circled this word, bore, and singled it out as special through the circle, and also discussed that she wasn't really sure how to write this because this is leek, which in French is poireau. And so it's fairly well integrated. It's a very common vegetable cultivated in market gardens. But she knows that this word comes from French, but French is not very prominent in her repertoire. She's not sure how to spell it. She spells it with LILIEMA, with the sound-grapheme associations she has learned, but she's not quite sure. And then other things emerge here, for instance, some variation in sound grapheme associations that I haven't marked on the PowerPoint slide, but I can briefly discuss. So, for instance, here she has written a word in Creole, carna, and according to the official LILIEMA conventions, carna, the initial velar plosive, should be written with the K grapheme, but she writes this in Portuguese orthography, which is also very widespread in the linguistic landscapes. But then there's another word, canja, for okra, that she writes with the K. And so these are instances where we just discussed that there are several options that exist and that you could also write carna with K, but that they're all perfectly fine. Finally, I just wanted to put this up very briefly. Some of you may have heard about this already in different contexts, and sorry for the typos. What was a really interesting test case for us to see whether actually our method was successful, and we actually achieved what we intended to do, enable people to create information and access information through this writing model, was that we used LILIEMA in 2020 for a COVID-19 information campaign, where we used official information diffused by the Senegalese government, but exclusively written in French, and translated it into several languages used in villages where LILIEMA was active, and so presented information in languages that were accessible to people, and also, and this was quite new, we believe, in a modality that we are sure is accessible to people. Because very often information, crisis information, is produced, written in local languages, but it is still inaccessible to the intended audience because they have not learned how to read and write their languages. And so if they have learned how to read and write, they have learned the official colonial languages. So it is actually redundant then to create this information in local languages, which in addition, people have not learned how to read. And so very often health information in local languages is only distributed through audio media, so radio. And here we wanted to actually reach out to people in written format, because this is it's very low cost and easy to distribute. So we had posters at central places in several villages, and we also had leaflets, and which was much easier than to create this information for the radio, for instance, and distribute it regularly via this channel. And also much more accessible than, for instance, creating YouTube videos, because most people in the villages have no access to electricity, have no smartphones, and if they have smartphones, they almost never have enough credit to buy a data connection and access video content. So here is an example for one village. So each village had a tailored multilingual format based on the most meaningful selection of languages to reach the maximum number of people in this village. So actually, I think from a communicative point of view, I think we have reached everybody, because there is nobody in this village who doesn't understand one or several of these languages, but we may have left out, of course, some languages that are important for people, but that are only spoken by a small number of people. So here you see, this is the language mix for this particular village. And we had, I think, I forget, but we had, I think, 18 different language mixes. And what is also important is that it is a real collaborative effort that is only possible by putting together the perspectives of different multilingual team members and linguists, because on another poster, there is the recommendation to sneeze not into your hand, but into your armpit. And this was very difficult to translate because there's only one word for hand and arm in most of the local languages. So if you say, don't sneeze into your hand arm, but sneeze into your hand arm, this is actually very ambiguous and counterproductive. So we had to find paraphrases to make clear the intended meaning. So, and the results are interesting because they confirm the results. We did a survey of the success of this method. So we did a survey with 700 participants and qualitative interviews with some focal participants who have accessed this information. And it shows really that language-based contexts are important, but the translanguaging is important for accessing information. Why? So first of all, I mean, the overall success was great. So the information was clearly accessible and understandable to the majority, and also increased knowledge of co-prevention measures for 99.7%, so for everybody. So it filled a real gap in information. But crucially, what was really important is how people access the multilingual information. So most participants reported that they first tried to find their focal language of identity or their focal languages of identity, and so try to find out whether a named language was represented on the posters. And once that language was represented, they described a deep feeling of validation, but also trustworthiness, because they said, wow, I know these are my relatives. They have written this message. These are people in my network. I can trust them, because no outsider would have been able to write this information. But in order to actually be able to access the multilingual information, they scanned the whole poster and built the message multilingually. And this is actually something that I also do in my own multilingual life. So for instance, I learned Finnish, and the linguistic landscape of Helsinki is quite multilingual. So you have a lot of signs that are bilingual in the two official languages of Finland, so Swedish and Finnish, or they are in Swedish, English, and Finnish. And so very often when the Finnish looks very long and complex, it's daunting for me as a language learner. So I quickly scan the Swedish text first. Swedish is a Germanic language, it's closer to me because my native language is German. And I find out what the text is about, and then I focus on the Finnish. And then when I see there are words that I don't understand, then I go back to the English. So this is also what these survey participants did. They really consumed the information in a multilingual way. And I think this is crucial, that we have both the importance of named languages, but the activation of the entire repertoire. So I'm coming to the end. Ways to move forward. I think this goes beyond the local context of Casamance. I think we need to acknowledge all places as heterogeneous and in continuous flux linguistically. And for multilingual literacy and education, I think for me the way forward is to take inspirations from existing reading and writing practices. And I didn't mention it here, and I've mentioned it in other talks, and you've seen it on the slide with the two billboards in Wolof. Existing reading and writing practices follow a lead language. So everything is written with the orthographic conventions of the first literacy of people. So in this case, as if it was French. And LILIEMA, and this is also attested in pre-colonial grassroots writing practices. So LILIEMA follows this principle. In this case, you can argue that Wolof is the actual lead language, the orthography that inspired the convention. And then everything is written with the same conventions, tolerating variation. And so this is something that really breaks with this exclusively language-focused way of conceiving literacy, creating orthographies, and teaching literacy that is very widespread in the global north. And so I think this is really important to develop further. But what I also think is that we need to respect existing language-focused practices. And so if people, for instance, feel, I'm a multilingual, but I really identify more as Gutjaha, and I'm not so interested in learning to write other languages. I really want to learn how to read and write Gutjaha. I think we need to respect this. And because it uses an alphabet that has been created for Wolof and is the basis of most of the official orthographies created for national languages of Senegal so far, we have actually found a solution that allows us to square the language-ing circle, because what we teach in a multilingual way is transferable to any other language in any other local context of Senegal. And I will stop here and hope we'll have some time for questions and discussions. Thank you.